All right, thanks everyone. I'm gonna begin with a bit of an introduction, and I'm gonna try to continue admitting people as I do that. And also I'm gonna begin recording this session. So FYI, if I can figure out how to do that. There we go. Okay.
Recording in progress.
All right. So folks, please mute yourselves if I didn't already mute you when you entered. Thanks so much. I will start us out here. So welcome to this talk on Title VI and the Academic Engagement Network. My name is Maya Gelman. I'm the director of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, and I'm going to moderate this session. Among many important talks looking at this horrific period in history that we are all trying to survive, this is a particularly important talk. We're going to hear from the scholars that you see on your screen who are doing groundbreaking research on the Academic Engagement Network and its relationship to the absolute avalanche of Title VI complaints that have been weaponized against students, faculty, and staff who oppose genocide, and that is more broadly driving a season of academic repression. This is the 7th or 8th event in the launch calendar of the Coalition to End Zionist Repression on the campus and academia table of that coalition, which itself has been full of events that are intended to resource all of your efforts to stop state violence and repression. And I'll put that link in the chat, but you probably can find it in the same place that you found the information about this. It's bit.ly/campus-alliance, but I will also post that in the chat in a moment. Just to recap, this past year, we have seen how clearly U.S. civic and political institutions are willing to do violence, Palestine and Lebanon, potentially the globe, and also at home. And just because it's important to continually name these things, we're seeing police attacks on students, evictions, search and seizure just yesterday at Indiana, I think it was, deportation threats, terror charges instrumentalized by Zionist and white-right political actors to silence their opponents, firing and unhiring of faculty, including some of us right here, spreading disinformation about the primarily Palestinian, Muslim, Jewish, BIPOC, and queer-led movement against genocide that endangers all of us every day. And as schools resumed in fall, several universities, including NYU, which is represented here, issued new policy that takes Zionist politics, having Zionist politics, and turns it into a protected identity like race. And this is an idea that Zionist advocates have been trying and failing to push into law and judicial precedent for years. And universities are now facilitating policy that's failed in the legal sphere. So these attacks increasingly weaponize the infrastructure of civil rights that was created to oppose racism and undo marginalization, even if we might have critiques of those structures. In particular, we're talking about civil rights agencies, anti-discrimination law, and DEI policy. As a historian, I can assure you that it is not new that the Zionist political movement has used the framework of civil rights and anti-discrimination to do this work. And just to be clear, by the Zionist movement, I mean, and I think we all mean, the political movement to develop Israel as a Western supremacist, Orientalist, colonial capitalist, Cold War project. What is new, I think, we could discuss it, is the level of violence. We are likely at something like 120,000 people who are dead. The United States has sent something like $18 billion to fund it, and then told hurricane survivors recently there's no money for them. We've been hearing numbers since the start of the genocide, like the US defense industry is running triple shifts to supply this genocide with weapons. The numbers are staggering. But what's also new is the extent of cooperation between political sectors that call themselves Zionist or pro-Israel and other sectors that we might just think of as right-wing or militarist or tech industry or just capital, right? These are the forces that are now together leveraging civil rights discourse as a weapon, including weaponized federal Title VI complaints and civil rights lawsuits and DEI policy demands. And they are dramatically under-researched. So this conversation, the reason I say it's important is because we are hearing from scholars who are doing essential research on this area of unknown, under-researched violence production. And since tonight is Yom Kippur, I personally am especially thinking of them in that context, that the research and the commitment to sharing it is supporting life against death. So I'm really grateful to you three. I will introduce the three of you, and then I will turn it over to you. And then just to reiterate for everybody who has just joined, please mute yourselves. You enter unmuted. You got to do it yourself. I don't get to you. We are recording, and you can put any questions in the chat, and I'll moderate the questions. And if needed, if it comes to it, I will bounce people out of the meeting. I hope that we don't get to that. We've actually not had that problem so far, so that's wonderful. Sean Malloy is a professor of history and critical race and ethnic studies at UC Merced and a member of the UC Ethnic Studies Faculty Council, and also on the founding collective of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. Mira Gold is a historian of science, archaeology, and empire, currently based in New York City. She's held teaching and research positions at NYU, York University, the European University Institute, and the University of Cambridge. And she's affiliated with Institute for Critical Study of Zionism, home team, NYU faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine, and is the development coordinator for National FJP. Zach Summerlin is an associate professor of English at NYU, where he's also a member of faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine, and a member at large of the executive committee of the American Association of University Professors. So I'm going to get out of the way now. Thanks so much. Don't forget to put your questions in the chat. Take it away, Sean.
Thank you, Amaya, and thank you all for coming today. I want to kick us off by trying to situate the Academic Engagement Network against a kind of larger backdrop of Zionist counter-mobilization against Palestinian solidarity on U.S. college campuses, because I think the AEN fills a particularly unique niche in that role, and it's helpful to understand where it comes from. And to do so, it actually helps to turn the clock back a little bit. While it is hard to believe now, prior to the early 2000s, Zionist organizations on campus had a relatively minimal presence outside of Hillel, which tended to brand itself more as a community space for Jewish students than it did as a Zionist organization. National Zionist lobbying groups, folks like AIPAC, the Anti-Defamation League, did give some sporadic attention to the campus. What I have on the screen for you now is some quotes from something called the AIPAC College Guide from 1984, which I will not read to you in the interest of time, but it is very interesting to see how even back in 1984, a lot of the rhetoric was similar. What was not similar was the level of engagement, right? While they were never entirely ignored, campuses were simply not a primary focus of these larger mainstream Zionist organizations, and there was relatively little in the way of formally organized and coordinated lobbying on campuses themselves. This begins to change in the early 2000s for reasons that you probably can put together, right? The collapse of the Oslo process, the Second Intifada, and most importantly, the rise of a grassroots BDS campaign and student organizing for Palestine on both American and British campuses. That growth in grassroots organizing led both the Israeli state and US-based Zionist organizations to begin to focus on the campus as a critical site of struggle. And in this respect, the AEN sits very neatly at the intersection of two forms of Zionist counter-mobilization over the last 20 years or so. And one response to, let's move here, there we go. One response to the rise of grassroots Palestinian activism and pro-Palestinian activism in the early 2000s was the creation of an entirely new set of Zionist organizations, many of which were either largely or in some cases entirely devoted to the campus. Older orgs like the ADL, AJC, AIPAC, they extended their campus operations. I know, just like all of you, I wake up every morning in my email to the daily campus crisis email from the ADL. But they were supplemented by a dizzying array of new groups in this period. Stand With Us, Israel on Campus Coalition, Campus Watch, the David Project, Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, Lawfare Project, Israeli Action Network, the Brandeis Center, the AMHA Initiative, Students Supporting Israel, Canary Mission, Alums for Campus Fairness, Zachor Legal Institute, the Maccabee Task Force, the Deborah Project. There is an entire list that I could keep reading for you that I won't in the interest of time. These national groups, as we'll see, are often directly or indirectly connected with one another, and they're also often allied with local campus groups. Most recently we see something like the Jewish Faculty Resilience Group, or JFrog at UCLA. Now, at the same time as these Zionist groups are proliferating on campuses, there are parallel developments taking place behind the scenes at federal agencies in Washington, D.C. And a key player here is a guy named Kenneth L. Marcus. Marcus got his JD from UC Berkeley, and he ended up serving as the staff director for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights under George W. Bush. And while he is there, he helped pioneers a reinterpretation of Title VI. This is the Dear Colleague letter he writes in September in 2004, which would now apply Title VI to religious groups, including Jewish students, as a protected category. That in turn opens up a slew of complaints filed by Zionist groups against a number of campuses. And then after he leaves the Commission on Civil Rights, he found the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, which is an innocuous name for a group that is largely concerned with cracking down on Palestinian solidarity on U.S. campuses, particularly around BDS. So he then goes around and encourages the filing of lawsuits and complaints under the rule change that he organized while in the federal government. He then goes back into the federal government as Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights under Trump, and then reopens some of the cases that had been previously closed. And then, revolving door, returns back to the Brandeis Center after his service under Trump. Marcus is very clear that even when these cases don't bear fruit legally, that they are designed to intimidate campuses, right? And he actually writes in the Jerusalem Post, these cases, even when rejected, expose administrators to bad publicity. If a university shows a failure to treat initial complaints seriously, it hurts them with donors, faculty, political leaders, prospective students. So we have these two trends beginning in the 2000s that have become very hyper visible since October 7th, and that is a proliferation of Zionist groups focused on the campus and the emergence of a federal legal apparatus under Title VI that allows these groups to weaponize as charges of anti-Semitism to bring legal and public pressure to bear on university administrators. And it's here that we get to a not-so-secret third thing, and that is the Academic Engagement Network. It's founded in 2015 by former University of California president Mark Yudof and Kenneth Waltzer. And its self-described mission is to oppose efforts to, what they say, delegitimize Israel and demoralize its supporters while protecting what they call the Zionist identities of students and faculty. Now, while the existence of the AEN is by no means a secret, right? They have their webpage. You can go look at a webpage. They have a YouTube channel if you're very bored. They maintain a much lower public profile than either big mainstream Zionist orgs like the ADL or the more campus-focused groups like Canary Mission or the AMHA Initiative. They don't rent out billboards or drive trucks around campuses. They don't mount big, splashy PR campaigns, nor do they typically go around filing or threatening to file Title VI complaints. Rather, what they do is they operate quietly and opportunistically in the space between those two tactics. So what often happens is that one of these more publicly facing Zionist groups will mount a high-profile attack on a university around issues of Palestinian solidarity. They will either file or threaten to file a Title VI complaint. And then the AEN will quietly come in behind the scenes. And usually they will directly contact the administrators of the university, often going through a DEI office, a diversity, equity, and inclusion office. And they will speak in these sweet tones of reason, or what passes for university administrators. And rather than threatening, what they tend to do is they offer their services in the form of either speakers or trainings that promise to inoculate universities against the bad PR and legal threats that they are now facing as a result of Palestinian solidarity activities on their campus. And so I became aware of this when it happened on my own campus. I was involved in co-sponsoring an event with some colleagues from San Francisco State University that would have featured Leila Khaled as a speaker. There was a huge public outcry from Zionist orgs and politicians, right? The Lawfare Project sent a 6-page letter to my chancellor saying we're all going to go to jail for violating the material support for terrorism law. U.S. congressmen, right? There's all this publicity saying you got to cancel this. And then quietly, while all of this is going on, the AEN directly contacts the administration of my university. And they say, hey, we're not here to threaten you, but this looks very bad for you. This looks like your campus has a hostile climate. And we stand ready to assist you in dealing with the repercussions of this horribly anti-Semitic event that might transpire. Make a long story short, Zuman ended up canceling the talk, didn't happen, but the AEN got their foot in the door. And for the next 2 years, my campus's DEI office sponsored AEN events with the speaker Jill S. Jacobs on anti-Semitism. Her primary qualifications were as an engagement strategist focusing on revenue growth and educational impact. And again, her real qualification for this was her connections to the Academic Engagement Network. And it is not a coincidence that this went through the DEI campus. The AEN is explicitly targeting DEI offices in a way that is, by their own admission, somewhat cynical, right? This is AEN Executive Director Miriam F. Ellman speaking at their national conference in May of 2022, who says, I'm not particularly thrilled with the trends we're seeing in requirements for promotion and tenure statements on DEI. But in terms of our work at AEN, it's going to be a boondoggle because it's going to give you a reason to be part of this network and then bring that back to campus. I'm not saying I'm supporting it in DEI. I'm saying we can strategically use that. And I learned that from working with Evan Morris at Yale, in particular on this grant, how important it is for offices on the university to be able to say this counts for us in the diversity, equity, and inclusion commitment, that we can tick off a check mark on the box by supporting an anti-Semitism awareness effort. Now, this kind of behind-the-scenes work with campus administrators to try to shape their response to Palestinian activism on campus is a big part of what AEN does, but it's not the only thing. Using their long list of contracts, and again, if you look at their board, it's almost all academics and administrators. They also work proactively to provide resources and trainings for college and university administrators, right? They published in 2022 this wonderful guidebook on anti-Semitism, Jewish identity, and freedom of expression on campus. I'm not going to read you all these quotes. I want to move us along to our next speakers. But part of the point here is that while the AEN is more low profile, it operates differently than some of these other Zionist groups, right? They tend to operate directly one-to-one with university administrations. Their goal is fundamentally no different from an ADL or a Canary Mission or an AMHA initiative, and that is to cement support for Zionism as a protected category while mustering administrative powers to contain or suppress Palestinian solidarity efforts on campus. And all of this long before October 7th. And I now want to turn things over to my colleagues who are going to speak about both the funding apparatus behind AEN and offer some insights into how this group is operating now in a kind of post-October 7th environment. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this, and thank you.
Thanks, Sean. That was a great demonstration of sticking to your time.
You didn't even have to yell at me, Maya.
I didn't. Mira, you're next, right?
Yes, I am.
Gotcha.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mira. So now that we've had that really wonderful introduction to the AEN's history briefly, and sort of where it fits into the broader ecosystem of this pro-Israel lobbying organizations outside and in academia. I want to give a brief overview, or as brief as I can, about the AEN's funding, its network affiliations, and overlapping board members and partnerships, and sort of what that can tell us as well about its overall tactics. So despite kind of, as we've heard a bit already, co-opting this, language of diversity and equity and inclusion and race. I want one consistent pattern is that there is a right-wing anti-intellectual ideological agenda across both the AEN's biggest funders and its leadership and board members. And then there is also, of course, its anti-BDS agenda, and it's very clear that that is one of the things that it promotes. But this also manifests in other ways, despite, beyond what they actually teach in their programs. So one is that, as I'll show you in a moment, there are several very close ties and partnerships with the Israeli government, particularly with the IDF and Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and especially the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs and Public Diplomacy, which was established specifically for fighting BDS globally, and even more specifically for doing that on US college campuses. You also see it in that the academic sort of representatives of the AEN and its recent additional arm that it's established, the Faculty Against Antisemitism Movement, is that they are amongst the staunchest, of course, defenders of Israel. But that is not they're both conservative and liberal, and also that they have many affiliations with Israeli academia, either because they have teaching positions, Israeli universities, or because they have been, they are invested somehow in the tech and science startup industry there. Another trend is that we'll see a lot of overlapping with what has been referred to as the Islamophobia network. So sort of these watchdog groups that continuously perpetuate anti-Muslim and Arab sentiments and narratives. And lastly, that we'll see that many of the overlaps kind of bleeds into debates that are ongoing right now outside of AEN, for example, in the AAUP, American University Professors, American Association of University Professors, and MLA as well. So I'm going to, okay. I'm going to move around this board. This is like a peek into my mind. So I'm only briefly going to touch upon the funders themselves. So as we've already heard, AEN was founded in 2015, and the initial funding came from the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Foundation, one of the biggest, I think actually the biggest by number private foundation that donates to pro-Israel organizations in the US. And that's currently run by Stacy Schusterman. And then also the Milstein Family Foundation, which is run by Adam Milstein. This was another person was added who I think gave the largest, as far as I can tell, contribution to the Academic Engagement Network last year was Bernard Marcus of Home Depot fame, among other things. Before I mention the rest of them, I just want to point out that what we'll see here is that most money is sort of channeled through the Israel On-Campus Coalition, which is an umbrella organization. So they, connect other organizations and really just kind of channel monies among their what they actually do. And then there are a couple of actual donations specifically to the Academic Engagement Network that come from Stacy Schusterman and Bernard Marcus. And I want to say just briefly that, when we're looking at funding, it's not always a consistent marker of, say, a philanthropist or the board members, politics, but in this case, there are some pretty clear overlaps. So I should say that, first of all, these are not all of them. I've just put on here some of the bigger ones. These are all billionaires who have inherited or earned, but mainly inherited their wealth from things like real estate investments, hedge fund investing, and oil and fracking, which is especially how the Schusterman and the Barron foundations made their wealth. These are also some of the biggest donors to AIPAC, and which I have down here. I didn't bother connecting it because it would just be too much. But to AIPAC and also to its sort of affiliated arms, that's including the American Israel Friendship League, which funds trips to Israel, and its charitable arm, the American Israel Education Fund. So Stacy Schusterman, Paul Singer, Joanna and Jonathan Jacobson, Julie Barron-Platt, and Bernard Marcus. And all of those names that I just mentioned are also notably major university donors, or in many cases also board members. So for example, Julie Barron-Platt, sometimes Julie Platt, is the new chair of the board of trustees at the University of Pennsylvania since December. It shouldn't be a surprise why she was graduated as chair during that period. And Paul Singer is on the board of Princeton, Jonathan Jacobson on the boards of Brandeis University and Harvard University. And finally, all of these board members are central parts to sort of the wider pro-Israel wing of the lobbying groups that operate in Washington, and kind of use some of those, either watchdog or lawfare tactics that we just heard about. Adam Milstein is among the more prolific funders of this type of work, especially in around campus advocacy and surveillance and doxing websites, and as well Miriam and the late Sheldon Adelson. So that organization is still funding a lot of these groups, and currently run by Miriam Adelson. And the last group here that I'll point out are these donor-advised funds, which are untraceable. In some cases, people call them dark money. Some of them operate also as organizations like the Jewish National Fund or the Jewish Communal Fund. They've become particularly popular ways to contribute for billionaires. Many of them also, I think all of them, fund some of these donor-advised funds as well. And it's popular to donate their funds to these donor-advised funds because they get immediate tax breaks and they get sort of put into a lower tax bracket. And some of these organizations fund really nefarious things like illegal Israeli settlements. So while we can't know who exactly has we can sometimes trace if somebody has donated to an organization, but often we don't know. It's untraceable. Okay. So I want to just move on to the ICC briefly, because it is very much connected to the AEN. In fact, the AEN is wholly a part of the Israel on Campus Coalition. There is really none of its funding that comes from anywhere else. The vast majority, sorry, I'm just, right, okay. So the ICC was founded in 2002 as a partnership with Hillel. I'm just going to zoom in here. There's Hillel right there. And its CEO, Jacob Boehm, and as well as at least two other members that I know of are former AIPAC employees, and that is very important to keep in mind. ICC collects data and publishes data about the BDS movement in partnership with organizations like the Anti-Defamation League. In 2015, if anyone has seen the Al Jazeera documentary on the Israel lobby, where FAAM was told an undercover reporter about the ICC and its funding, and described their work as, quote, psychological warfare. And he also confirmed that the ICC shares surveillance data and intelligence with the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs. ICC also partners with a couple of organizations that did not make it onto this chart yet: the Network Contagion Research Institute and Census Limited. The AEN has also announced a new partnership with the Contagion, also works with Contagion Institute. And these are pro-Israel, specifically pro-Israel tech surveillance platforms that kind of come out of this startup nation in Israel.
Sarah, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second to give you your 3-minute warning.
Oh, geez. Okay. So I'm just going to then quickly move on to, thank you, the AEN and AES. So I don't have enough time, nor would it be legally advisable for me to name too many specific names here. In terms of overlaps between the Academic Engagement Network and Faculty Against Antisemitism. I'm happy to return to this during discussion or questions after, if we'd like. What you have here on the right are explicitly pro-Israel, self-identified as such, organizations and organizations in Israel, either in the government or just think tanks, etc., that the board members of either of these two organizations are tied to. And on the left, you have universities that the board members are tied to, and you have other organizations that they're also tied to. One of the organizations on this list that I want to quickly talk about is the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism, which was founded in 2004 and has since expanded to the UK and the US, most recently to NYU, where they're affiliated now with the Bronfman Center and the new NYU Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. It was founded by Charles Asher, at the time from Tel Aviv University. You might recognize him if you've been following those news from recent reportings about his reporting here to the Ways and Means Committee in Congress, where he is leading the charge to investigate SJP, Student for Justice in Palestine, on counterterrorism charges and on investigating university donor funding from Qatar, which is ironic because ISGAP was found to have received thousands of undisclosed funds from the Israeli government a few years ago. On their board are members of the Israeli state, including Nathan Sharansky, former prime minister, member of Likud, and Sima Vaknin-Gil, IDF veteran and head of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. Also on that board is Carrie Nelson, former board member, chair of the AAUP. He has, here is an article he co-wrote with Faculty Against Antisemitism board member Michael Sangar in 2003. And he is also, Carrie Nelson, leading the charge with Stephen Pinker, who is also an AEN board member, challenging the AAUP's recent reversal on boycotts. And the ISGAP also has several overlapping board members with AAEN and Faculty Against Antisemitism Movement. We have Miriam Ellman, who we already heard about, and Erwin Kotler, who is a big name. He is also on the advisory board of the Louis D. Brandeis Institute, or Center for Human Rights, which we heard about, and other watchdog groups like Memory, right-wing groups like United Against Nuclear Iran, and UN Watch. and also former board of governors for the Jewish People Policy Institute, which is essentially a branch of the Jewish Agency for Israel, and the NGO Monitor, all affiliated with the Israeli state. And you have Ellen S. Cannon, who is an advisory board member for Faculty Against Antisemitism, professor at Northeastern and DePaul, board of ISCAP, and the American Jewish Committee, which recently hosted a giant gathering of university presidents to fight anti-Semitism. And as well, she is on the boards of the American Jewish Congress. She is formerly a consulate member of the Israeli consulate, Midwest Israeli consulate, and several Jewish federations. And finally, Amy Elman, no relation to Miriam Elman, who is a board member of the Amcha Initiative, who just put out a really delightful report on Faculty for Justice in Palestine. So I'll sum up, and you can, as I say my final 2 words, I'll just leave this on here if you can squint and see it. So this is only some, obviously, of the AEN's overlapping networks, though I would suggest that ISCAP is a particularly important one because it enables AEN to act like ISCAP as sort of an extension of the Israeli state. And despite these numerous sort of right-wing, anti-intellectual, pro-Israel biases, and in many cases, specifically anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim, Islamophobic affiliations and bodies of work from its board members, the AEN markets itself as really this trusted academic authority on anti-Semitism, and in the process, their programs encourages this complete erasure of Palestinian lives and perspectives, as well as of anti-Zionist Jewish identities, and in pushing anti-BDS policies, despite having a complete lack of any expertise among their boards or teachers in post-colonial studies, race, ethnicity studies, etc. And finally, despite their claim that they work to, quote, promote academic freedom, they do the exact opposite, of course. They encourage and empower, to use their own words, universities to stifle all legitimate criticism of Israel, Zionism, and academic freedom of speech. And I will now pass it over to our colleague, Zach. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much to everybody for logging on, and to Amaya for getting this conversation, putting us in touch with each other, and to Sean and Mira for sharing your research, not just with everybody else who's here, but with me. I mean, I haven't done the same kind of deep historical or political economic dives that they have, but I'm instead going to talk just about the partnership between AEN and NYU, where I work. So it's maybe a little more journalistic or ethnographic. That relationship between AEN and NYU stretches back several years, at least to 2021, possibly further. I'm doing my best to learn more about this relationship, in part I've been trying to interview administrators at NYU who have been through the training seminars, the signature seminars, and have also been, several of our administrators at NYU have been on the AEN-sponsored trips to Israel that are the summer kind of culmination of the year-long seminars that they've done. And I'm planning to put together a report about this once I've collected some more material that I think could serve as a kind of case study of what it looks like when an avowedly partisan Zionist organization like AEN gains what appears to be a kind of full and uncontested access to the disciplinary apparatus of an academic institution. I mean, based on Mira's chart, I have a feeling that this will be useful to people at other campuses that are undergoing similar repressive crackdowns. AEN seems very much to be in demand in helping schools to develop more strategies for censoring and repressing pro-Palestinian speech and activism that's even minimally critical of Israel's widening campaigns of destruction and genocidal violence in Palestine and now Lebanon as well. And at NYU, our repressive apparatus has really been getting a kind of workout. Over the last year, there's been dozens of students, faculty, and staff arrested, pepper sprayed. Faculty and staff have been fired from their jobs for speaking out. Students have been punished for protesting and forced to complete these kind of like infantilizing corporate ethics training modules. And our campus is, I mean, if I could show you out my window right now, you'd see there's just walls everywhere, cops everywhere. And I think that this is something that is really being facilitated by the kind of partnership that's going on between our administrators and the AEN. So I first heard about AEN recently after this summer, after NYU came to a closed-door settlement with a group of Zionist students that were represented by Donald Trump's former lawyer, Mark Kasowitz, these students had sued NYU last fall, alleging in kind of lurid and sometimes absurd terms that the university had failed to protect them from anti-Semitic faculty and student protesters in the days immediately after October 7th. Right. And for the most of last year, NYU had been pursuing the course of trying to have that suit dismissed. And not in a great way, but that was what they were trying to do. And then suddenly over the summer, they changed course. And here, I'll just, not that this text is especially illuminating, but they changed course and agreed to settle out of court in a private settlement. And so in addition to offering monetary rewards for the students, NYU also agreed to hire a new Title VI coordinator who will, quote, review and implement all applicable regulations and guidance from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, and including OCR's 2021 and 2024 guidance regarding the use of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, definition of anti-Semitism and the accompanying examples. And that last part was a novelty on NYU, where we had adopted IRA, I'll talk about this in a moment, 3 years ago, but we had specifically not signed on to the examples, and now we seem to have done so. And NYU also agreed to issue an updated guidance to its non-discrimination and anti-harassment policy. And that came in early September and included now, on our campus at least, infamous and incoherent provisions that Zionism can be protected under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act because it's part of, quote unquote, Jewish identity. And also as a kind of corollary to that, the term Zionist can sometimes be treated as an anti-Semitic code word for Jew. And finally, as part of the settlement, NYU also agreed to, quote, strengthen its existing relationships with Tel Aviv University. So this is what's been this is like the kind of general climate at NYU, and it's obviously just been accompanied by increasing repression in the ways that I've described. The Miriam Elman, who we've heard about, the executive director of the AEN, this is when I first came to hear about this organization. This is the guidance. And I can come back to this later if people want, but using code words like Zionist does not eliminate the possibility that your speech violates the NDAH, right? So Elman applauded NYU's settlement publicly on Twitter and commended our president, Linda Mills, and stating that AEN was looking forward to continuing to work with NYU administrators and officials. And this was the first time that most of us at NYU FSJP had heard of AEN and certainly of their sort of longstanding relationship to NYU. So we began to, I mean, when I say we, I mostly mean me and Mira, began to dig a bit. On Twitter, there were photographs of the director of our Office of Student Conduct at a summer conference where President Mills had also apparently given the keynote. On the homepage of the AEN website, there was a photo of Mills on an AEN trip to Israel. Articles turned up about other admin, a senior VP who was kind of felling about his training and his trip to Israel with AEN. I found a public document from early 2022 that talked about quote unquote regular meetings between AEN and senior administrators at NYU. And so what seems probable to me, and I'm trying to sort of establish this conclusively, is that NYU entered into a partnership with AEN in 2020 after the university had settled an earlier Title VI anti-Semitism complaint with the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights. And it was in that earlier settlement, now 4 years ago, that NYU agreed to adopt the IRA definition in its conduct code, and also to partner with, at that point, I've read only the settlement, but they agreed to partner with an undisclosed outside organization in order to offer regular anti-Semitism bias and sensitivity trainings for admin. So that's kind of where that relationship, I think, most likely begins. I think what was striking to me about this, as I began to poke around, was not so much the length or extent of NYU's participation in AEN's training, but rather the kind of the imprint that AEN has clearly left on our updated NDAH guidance, right? So this is, right, this line here about, for many Jewish people, Zionism is part of their Jewish identity, is, straight out of the AEN mission statement, right? So this is their homepage. This is the photo of our university president, I believe. And their mission statement is to mobilize networks of university faculty and administrators to counter anti-Semitism, oppose the denigration of Jewish and Zionist identities, promote academic freedom. Right. And then again, they say, this is sort of throughout their guide and resource book for faculty and university leaders. There's just this continued sort of emphasis on the problem that it becomes for Jewish students when people criticize Zionism because it's part of their identity, right? So they're really interested in shifting that focus on Zionism from the political to the identity politics, I guess, would be one way to say that. When I spoke to our director of student conduct about his participation in the year-long signature seminar training, he confirmed to me that this emphasis on identity was the main takeaway for him from his training. He reported to me that the training had helped him shift his understanding of the Israel-Palestine conflict, this is a quote, from a purely political discourse thing to something that involves questions of national and ethnic identity, and therefore deserves a closer look. So throughout our hour-long conversation, he insisted several times that, quote, ideology didn't creep into the education with AEN, and that, quote, he never felt like he was being indoctrinated. And I did point out to him that you're not supposed to feel like you're being indoctrinated while it's happening. However, when I asked him to what extent Palestine in the broadest possible sense came up at all in the training, he was kind of like at a loss. The training was about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and not about Palestine or Palestinians, he said. And of course, it's pro-Palestinian protesters who are articulating these allegedly anti-Semitic views in this account. But this is, I think he basically treated this as a kind of logistical disciplinary problem and that he was sort of insulated from needing to think about Palestine at all, right? So I'm trying to give like a little bit of a psychosocial analysis, just because these are the sort of functionaries that we're having to deal with while doing activism on campus, right? So substantive understanding about what protesters are actually protesting is unnecessary, and AEN sort of makes it unnecessary, and it's also in a sense a liability. Since a more lenient, if he were to sort of maintain that his more lenient attitude towards speech, it could itself expose the university to Title VI violations under the speech code that AEN has helped to draft, right? And this is again sort of consistent with the AEN line in their literature, which asserts things like, when anti-Zionist students march through campus chanting, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," they may be engaging in free speech, but it should be clear that the content of their speech is the eradication of an entire country and the violent murder of its citizens, right? So there's, again, just this sense that this is hyper insulated from thinking about Palestine, right? And in the nearly 300 pages of AEN's guide and resource book, the word Palestine as a standalone word, apart from frequent occurrences and quotations in the titles of groups like SJP, it appears only 2 times. Right. And it's a kind of realization, I think, of Said's point half a century ago, the way that Zionism has hidden or caused to disappear the literal historical ground of its growth. its political cost, the native inhabitants of Palestine, and its militantly oppressive discriminations between Jews and non-Jews. Palestine is literally everywhere in the guidebook and nowhere. And this is, for example, the definition of Zionism that AEN has offered in the guidebook and that has been offered to our administrators. Zionism, in its most fundamental sense, is a quintessential progressive movement as it realized the national liberation of a historically persecuted people. And I'm going to wrap up, but I'm just trying to appreciate what it means that this is the sort of perverse understanding of this political situation that our administrators are being being trained to hold, right? And I want to again I think that NYU is a good case study of this, just because we've been doing it for a few years, and we seem to have really allowed this AEN a kind of untrammeled access to the disciplinary apparatus. It's got a kind of unrestricted role. And, I think maybe just one final point is that clearly, we need to see, I think that's all I got from slides. We need to see the NYU AEN relationship in the context of this broader political campaign that Sean was speaking about, to institutionalize and codify a fully ideological conception of Zionism. This goal is shared by Israel, its defenders, and now also what we see in the US by kind of right-wing ideologues who have opportunistically seized on the alleged anti-Semitism of campus protests as part of a broader assault on higher ed and civil rights. But one of the more unnerving things that I think came into focus for me from the conversations I've been having with this kind of middle management layer of our disciplinary apparatus at NYU is the extent to which that politics is not really part of it. I think for trustees, for presidents, funders, many colleagues, sometimes for middle management people, sometimes not, there's this sort of shared ideological commitments either with right-wing and or Zionist interests, but with this middle management labor, there's kind of no stake. And instead, they see AEN training as akin to other kinds of outsourced university business and services that have become the bread and butter of the corporate university. And that means that they view complex problems like student protest of US complicity with Israel's genocide in Gaza strictly in terms of the calculative terms of liability, right? So yeah, it really does feel like this is a major piece of the problem, I think. It's maybe obvious, but I think it needs emphasizing, because it sometimes seems to me that we misunderstand the way that administrators think or fail to think, assuming that they simply don't know or have been misinformed about the distinction between Zionism and anti-Semitism, or about how Zionist ideology functions by occluding Palestine and Palestinian life from its own history, which is true. They definitely don't understand that, and they have been misinformed, and they probably will never get it. But what seems to me no less important is that the liability approach actually encourages and maybe even requires them not to know, right? Not to know these things. And instead requires them to adopt a kind of micro-fascistic corporate or bureaucratic mindset in which the less you know, the better, because knowing something can itself be a kind of liability, right? And I think that AEN supplies them, this is sort of what they're in the service of providing to a certain, from the university administrator perspective, right? It supplies them with the exemption of having to know anything substantive. And while at the same time, it's clearly fulfilling its own ideological aim of institutionalizing Zionism and undermining civil rights, right? So I guess, the main lesson, I've been rereading The Authoritarian Personality to try and figure out how to talk to the disciplinary administrators at NYU. And I guess the main lesson is run, don't, if your university has not yet partnered with the AEN, you should, try and figure out how to prevent them from doing so. And, we need to do, we need probably partly through legal struggles over Title VI liabilities, we do need to expose the AEN with its veneer of academic legitimacy as the explicitly biased and partisan organization that it is, and it doesn't hide that. right? And I think that not just legal suits, but also a kind of labor struggle seems really central to the way that we can resist something like the AEN. And I know that our graduate student union has been trying to think about the way that AEN implemented these changes to our non-discrimination and anti-harassment policy as a kind of change in the terms of employment. So if you're at a unionized campus, like this seems like a really important arena. But at the same time, yes, I think we need to be exposing AEN in this sense, but there's also this other component that seems really important to me is just of recognizing that for the corporate apparatus or administrative apparatus of our universities, having the better argument is not only besides the point, but is really, I think, and sometimes they perceive it as dangerous or a liability. And I think we need to be also thinking about that as a kind of terrain of struggle in its own right. So I'll stop there. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Thanks so much, everybody. I'm going to spotlight all of our speakers again, and we have, if I can figure out how to do this, we have questions from the chat, which I will pull from. We're at 1 hour. I think we probably could take another 15 minutes or so if our speakers can stay to talk about questions. I'm just going to start with, so we have some sort of technical questions, which I think indicates how much people really are starved for knowledge and information about how this stuff works. So just the question of, like, when you mention partnerships between AEN and other universities, what is the relationship? Are universities paying for it? Is there financial stuff involved? What does it mean?
Has anyone, I mean, I can guess. I haven't actually looked into it. So if either Sean or Zach, if you know the answer to this specifically, you can answer. But I think it's tied to, Zach, what you just mentioned about it, increasingly outsourcing some of this, programming universities. And so, in other words, yes, it's absolutely, they're paying for it. But maybe an extra factor to consider is that in those overlapping board memberships that I was speaking about, those include the universities. So, it's almost like this, like circular, thing where you have some of the board members are also funding universities, and, we don't know if universities are investing in certain programs, for example, which is part of the effort to disclose. So good question. If either of you have more information.
Yeah, I haven't seen any of the contracts that went around either at my university or elsewhere. My guess, and this is an educated guess, is that a lot of this assistance is being provided either at low cost or free. Because these are very, as Mira documented, these are very well-funded organizations. And I think it is particularly, obviously this is happening everywhere. It's happening in NYU, but I do particularly worry about smaller public institutions that are often cash-strapped, right? And so you get, you're a state university, you get put on blast on media and by your local representative from Congress because of all the quote unquote anti-Semitism as a result of Palestinian solidarity. Oh my God, what are we going to do? We're being sued. And then in comes the AEN saying, hey, we gotcha, right? Here's a list of speakers you can have for low cost or free. Here's some trainings. And, obviously, even in a place at NYU that is not underfunded, this is a potentially compelling argument because even rich universities, particularly rich universities, do not like negative publicity. And so this is an inoculation against that, or at least from the Zionist side. But I really do particularly worry about smaller places where there's less attention. They are very cash-strapped. And, if I'm an administrator at a small state college and there's this crisis going on, and this group that, again, speaks in the register of the university, right? Unlike some of these organizations that are going around, blanket attacking the university or doxing students, the AEN knows how to speak like an administrator because they are administrators. And so they come in very reasonably and offer you things at a low or free cost. Again, haven't seen the contracts, but that's certainly my guess. And it's very tempting, right? And I think Zach's point about outsourcing is here. It's outsourcing the thinking, right? It's not even outsourcing. It's not just outsourcing the material aspects of providing training. It's outsourcing the thinking. And I think both, for administrators, they don't want to think and they don't want to spend money. And the AEN solves both of those problems at once.
Can I just a quick follow-up point as I was thinking about this in terms of AEM programming? I think everything we just mentioned, Sean, is absolutely true for some of the external programs. For example, the year-long seminars and workshops that they have for administrators and the trips that they send administrators on to Israel. But one of the major things that they do, like all of these sort of pro-Israel advocacy organizations, is they train their members to do the Hasbara for them, to do the legitimization of Israel for them. So you have at individual universities, I only spoke about board members, but of course you have like hundreds more at every university college who are trained in the talking points, and they might hold seminars free of charge if they work there, for example, or students might do it in collaboration with Hillel. So in that case, it's free. Is another kind of component of it.
Yeah, I would just add, like, the reason why I use that word partnership is because both sides are getting something out of it. And it's not the same thing, right? So I do feel like there's a kind of collaborative or partnering aspect to it. And one side is getting to promote their ideological perspective and kind of institutionalize it. And the other side is sort of getting off the hook from having to take any kind of make any kind of commitment to reality, the nightmare of reality.
So there are three buckets of questions that I think we could probably get to if we group them. The first is just about like how to access this research and data sharing and stuff. So Mira, there was a question about whether your mapping is available, and then another question about what does it actually mean to trace the Israel on Campus Coalition back to the JNF. And I want to just sort of, I guess I want to ask you, Mira, if you're planning to produce this in some way that can be shared.
Yes.
I mean, or any of you, actually. I know there's more than.
Yeah, really good question. I think I'm so much at sort of the research and investigation stage, and it's kind of overwhelming, actually, all of the connections. There are ways to work on things together, or even, with the Institute broadly as well. If you want to, make use of the research in terms of, that map is something that I just produced out of the research that I did. So I'm happy to share that, as is, if you want to, email me or get in touch. It's freely available information, basically, from tax filings and things like that I've just kind of cobbled together. So, but also, yeah, I will publish, I haven't figured it out is the answer.
Okay, well, one thing we can do, I see there's also some questions in the chat about, links to the resources. We'll package stuff up and send it out. And I think the short answer is also that there's more like forthcoming because this is work that's underway and right. So another bucket of question is, what are the possibilities for intervention here? So one person is asking, if, is it possible to use the IRA definition calling for not singling out Israel or not giving it special negative attention in the other direction? I also have questions about what you were saying, Zach, about the sort of agnosticism of the DEI staff who are taking these trainings. Like, where are the levers for intervention that you see?
Well, I do think that we need to start thinking of these, like, the kind of corporate administrative structure as a kind of fascist or micro-fascist structure. Like, it just seems to me like that's kind of how I find it very useful to think of that sort of blankness in the face when I'm talking to this, director of our student conduct office. Very busy guy. He feels very besieged. He feels misunderstood, but there's a kind of emptiness inside of him that is like he's shielding himself from having to have an experience that is not stabilized by what he learned or what this training is supposed to provide for the university with. And I think that, to me, again, that does kind of rule out, to a certain extent, engaging with this in terms of a kind of liberal argumentation, right? And on the other hand, I think it's necessary, like obviously a place like NYU, they clearly only understand the language of lawsuits, right? So part of any struggle is going to probably involve an argument that something like this kind of redoubled commitment to the AEN has produced a hostile environment itself, and there will be a kind of Title VI countersuit that could be put together by that. But that is also like, feels sort of, dangerous and depressing from the perspective of higher education, even if it has a kind of locally enabling impact on our capacity to protest what's going on in the world. So I do think that the kind of labor struggle aspect of this feels to me like a really important piece. Like it's just another kind of collectivity that doesn't have to be evacuated of ideas in order to produce power. And I think that's, and I say that as, obviously like that, is not something that's immediately available to tenured faculty at private universities in the United States, but it still feels like that is the kind of template and probably, in my view, like the place where this needs to begin.
Yeah. I mean, I think if this last year has made anything crystal clear, and I think it was probably already clear, is that the existing institutions around us will not save us, right? Whether that is a university administration or whether that's fire, right? As we're talking about in the chat. And we obviously, we continue to exist in those institutions and continue to need support. And so, I think Zach's research is a good example of why it does make sense to speak with administrators, right? Talk with these folks. On my campus, a number of us emailed our administration when we realized AEN was doing these things, and we did, I think, talk them out of doing it. But at the same time as we engage with the administration, I think we need to recognize that universities as currently structured are acting this way for a reason, right? The system is what the system does. And the crucial thing we need to do is organize our own institutions to counter this, right? I think it's why the work of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism is so important, why the institution building that's being done across the movement is so important. Because while we cannot ignore these institutions, we do have to work within them and work with them. We cannot rely upon them to save us. And that means building our own bases of knowledge and our own bases of not just knowledge, but power. And whether that's through unions or whether that's through things like the ICSZ, that ultimately is where we need to go, because none of the institutions of our current society is prepared for this moment.
And this is part of it too, about, starting with, do people know about the AEN? Because at this point, a lot of academics, even if they've already been faced with repression and censorship, or their students might not even know who's sort of behind some of these, kind of changing in policies and things like that. And I do think there's a way, and this is, we're going to be launching a sort of Drop AEN campaign shortly. And I think that's important because we've seen that awareness around some of these issues, either not just in academia, but publicly, actually has a profound impact. A few years ago, most people didn't know who AIPAC was. And now there is a giant pushback against AIPAC lobbying. Same thing with, in much thanks to some of Amaya's work, the ADL, and now also to Hillel as well. So I think we need to start kind of putting AEN up in that list of these organizations that should be dropped, even though they operate more behind the scenes. So that is the extra, I think, challenge.
I want to ask one question to get us to sort of wrap us up. I will just say I see Andrew's question in the chat, which is the question of like, what do they know about us? But are we mapped in the same way that aside, aside from Canary Mission, do these organizations understand how we work? But I want to sort of put another angle on the question, which is, what do you expect the pushback to be? I will just say, so Drop the ADL from Schools launched like a week or two ago. And today the ADL put up a very specific guide on how to teach about anti-Semitism in K-12 schools. So it doesn't mention, you don't mention your oppo, right? But clearly there is some sort of move to push back. There's also similarly, Drop Hillel has sort of announced itself. And there is now suddenly news articles about they're trying to cancel Hillel. So I just, if you could give us like 1 or 2 sentences, no more, on how you anticipate the pushback from AEN and the forces that are sort of working with it on this kind of revelation. Top question.
Well, it's already been mentioned that the AEN doesn't really do doxing, which is why it's important to note that they have overlapping board members with, for example, Initiative, because, and that is the closest thing I've seen to them trying to trace at least the academic side of it, sort of, Faculty for Justice in Palestine. I think it's a good sign that they were already acting in defense this year, as opposed to going on the offensive, which is the main strategy of Israel's anti-BDS programs, because they set up Faculty Against Antisemitism specifically as a response to Faculty for Justice in Palestine. And to the point of Maya's note in the comments, they fundamentally don't understand how grassroots organizing works. So whereas their infrastructure relies on top-down astroturfing, lots of money and power, not that many people, we rely on people, some of whom are very deliberately careful not to share their identities because they will be doxxed. And yeah, maybe those of us who haven't been doxxed sufficiently might get some more of it, but I also think that tactic is getting tired and people see it for what it is. When you call a bunch of, anti-Zionist Jews, for example, anti-Semitic, it really means nothing, and it's quite sad, actually. So, that's my thought on it. I'm sure they will retaliate, but I think we are stronger and that we have more people.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I don't think it'll come from the AEN. I think it'll come through these other orgs. And, the question of, are they meeting behind closed doors to work out this strategy or not doesn't really matter. They're all on the same page ideologically. They believe the same things. They all read each other's press releases. They don't even need to have meetings. And if it follows the past pattern, a lot of the response will be to target individuals, right? Try to pick off individuals, make them feel isolated and alone and under threat. And it is all the more reason why we need to be emphasizing practices of solidarity with each other. We need to defend each other. We need to organize, because while we have many, it's hard to leverage that power if we're not organized, right? If we are many working in isolation, we are easier to pick off. We are easier, even if they don't pick us off, just exhaustion is going to take us down, right? So finding ways to organize effectively together, communicate effectively together. Events like this one, right? I didn't know Zach and Mira before this event, and now we do. And so this kind of, I think the work that's being put on by the coalition, Amaya, is serving that purpose, right? It's not just about education, it's about connecting people and getting people in spaces where we find who we can trust. And we build our power together because, as they say at the end of every rally, we keep us safe.
Yeah, I would just add that once you've read the AEN's guidebook together, you're bonded for life. It just wouldn't matter whose side you're on, actually.
I might call it DEI for Dummies, because I think the best, seriously, some of the pamphlets. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all so much for the research and for your explanations and for thinking through these questions. You're not doxed, but searchable if people want to find you to reach out with questions. And also if folks, if folks want to just email via the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, we can commit to passing on your questions. That's info@criticalzionismstudies.org. I encourage you to go look at the other Campus and Academia Alliance events. There's more illuminating stuff happening, and we really appreciate all of you. So thank you very much, and we'll see you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Recording stopped.